Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for staying with us for our coverage of President Biden's first address to a joint session of Congress tonight. The president tweeted this photo ahead of his remarks tonight, writing that he's, quote, looking forward to tonight's address to recap our progress and chart a path forward. We also received some early excerpts from the president's speech. On vaccines, he's expected to say, quote, we have to prove democracy still works, that our government still works and can deliver for the people. In our first 100 days together, we have acted to restore the people's faith in our democracy to deliver. We're vaccinating the nation. We're creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. We're delivering real results people can see and feel in their own lives, opening the doors of opportunity, guaranteeing fairness and justice. In just about 3 hours, President Biden will enter the House chamber. He'll deliver his speech in person to only about 200 people. That may sound like a lot during a pandemic, but not if you compare it to the first time Mr. Biden attended an address to a joint session of Congress as vice president in 2009. There was a packed House of more than 500 lawmakers plus guests. It does look like a State of the Union address, so why isn't it being called one? The short answer, President Biden hasn't been in office long enough to address the full State of the Union, as it's set out in the Constitution. Instead, every president since Ronald Reagan has chosen to call the remarks their first speech before a joint session of Congress. These are usually more forward-looking than a State of the Union address, too. Nikole, Killion, and Caitlin Huey-Burns join us now ahead of the speech tonight. Nikole is a CBS News congressional correspondent, and Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter. Welcome to you both. Well, Caitlin, since we spoke, we learned that President Biden will meet with Democratic and Republican leaders from the House and Senate 2 weeks from today, May 12th, to try and, as Press Secretary Jen Psaki describes it, talk in person about how we can partner on the goals of restoring trust in government and ensuring that government delivers for the American people. What is the goal of the meeting?
Yeah, this is a big deal. This is the first time that Biden will be sitting down with what we call the Big Four, so the top leaders of the House and Senate. So he's going to be meeting with McCarthy and McConnell, as well as Schumer and Pelosi. The first time all four of them are sitting down together with the president. And there is a lot on that to-do list, namely how to get this infrastructure bill through Congress. That is in two parts, the second of which is going to be detailed more tonight in the president's address. Biden is someone who campaigned on bipartisanship, on working across the aisle, on leaning into these long relationships that he's had. He's known McConnell for a really long time, but they haven't seen much payoff of that. The COVID relief package that passed earlier this year passed with only partisan support. Republicans want to have a role in this conversation when it comes to infrastructure, but as we've been talking about, the two sides are still very far apart. And even as both sides are wanting some kind of bipartisanship, you even heard Mitch McConnell on the floor earlier today ahead of this speech, kind of doing his own preview, kind of saying that Biden has, quote, given up on unity in favor of catnip for the liberal base. And he called this new infrastructure proposal, quote, social liberal engineering. So the two sides are very far apart. We'll see if this meeting can do anything to kind of bring them together. But it is important that this is the first time in his presidency that Biden is sitting down with these leaders, even though he's hosted bipartisan gatherings in the past.
Well, Nikole, you have had your eye on the lawmakers giving responses to President Biden tonight. What do you know about the preparation, starting with Republican Tim Scott?
Well, as you just gave us a preview of what the president would say, we also have gotten excerpts of what Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina will say, and he will largely echo a lot of Republican themes that we have heard throughout the administration. For instance, he will talk about the importance of reopening schools, saying locking vulnerable kids out of the classroom is locking adults out of their future. He will also address the coronavirus pandemic and talk about the fact, from a Republican standpoint, that they feel that the Biden administration actually inherited a program that was well developed in terms of Operation Warp Speed, and that the tide had already turned before the Biden administration came in. So he will make a nod to that. And then he will also talk about the state of the economy, saying that this was an inclusive economy, prior to COVID. So he will also talk about some of the Republican accomplishments and accomplishments of the Trump administration with respect to the economy, criminal justice reform, and talk about the importance of getting back to some of those pillars, again, in Republicans' view. I did have a chance to speak with Senator Scott, who told me that he is feeling very good about this address, that he will deliver a positive message tonight, and he did work on this speech over the weekend in Charleston, we're told, according to a source who is close to the senator, but he also knows how high profile a moment this is, so he has been taking some time to decompress as well. He's been posting videos of himself on the treadmill, and he's been watching shows on streaming networks, so he's kind of also, juggling writing this speech, but also trying to decompress at the same time, which we all can understand in a high-pressure moment like this.
Sure, we're showing some of, I think, what you're talking about now. I guess the message is senators, they're just like us. They need to decompress sometimes. All right,
Absolutely.
Nikole, we're also getting a second response tonight from progressive New York Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowen. What are we expecting there?
Yeah, that's right. So he will be delivering the address for the progressives, and so you will really hear him tout some of the ideals that are important to progressives. And keep in mind, this is a tradition that we have seen grow over the last couple of years. Folks in the past who have delivered this type of response include Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, to name a few. So you can expect, obviously, with the congressman really being kind of like the new Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in terms of this new breed of Democrat that has come into the House, by taking out an established Democrat. That is really kind of what has propelled him into this position and into this role tonight as someone who is kind of part of this newer squad. So you will hear him kind of tout some of those ideals that are important to progressives, whether that is eliminating or reducing student debt, Medicare for all, health care reform, those types of issues will be prominent in his address tonight.
Well, Caitlin, I want to dig a little deeper into the American Families Plan President Biden is featuring in his speech tonight. Specifically, what did not make it into the package? What got left out that progressive Democrats were pushing for?
That's right. There's a lot of questions about whether Republicans can get on board with some of these proposals. But remember, Democrats have such a narrow margin in the House that they have to keep their Democratic caucus intact. And there are several things that Democrats have wanted to see for a while that didn't make it into the president's proposal. So things like lifting that cap on state and local tax deductions, that's been something that Democrats have been clamoring for. Also, they want to expand Medicare. They also want to see the price of prescription drugs addressed in legislation. And while the president's proposal includes a temporary expansion of the child tax credit, Democrats, progressive Democrats, have really wanted a more permanent child tax credit. So that's something that they've been pushing for as well. I asked House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer about this earlier. Can you get all the Democrats that you need on board if it doesn't include these things? And he reminded me that while a president proposes ideas, Congress actually writes the legislation. So look for whether Democrats are able to get some of those line items into the actual text of the bill. And then, of course, that raises a question of, as much as you're trying to get Democrats on board, does that then alienate some of the Republicans that you may need? Now, they can pass potentially a measure with reconciliation, not needing a majority support in the Senate, but they haven't declared yet whether that is the route they are going to go. And we'll hear if that's a topic of conversation when Biden meets with the 4 leaders of Congress in a couple of weeks.
Right. And on that point, Nikole, Republican lawmakers want President Biden to keep them involved in his new proposals. Where do their negotiations actually stand at this point?
Well, nothing has started in earnest with respect to the American Families Plan, and already for some Republicans, it's a non-starter simply because of the tax hikes that are involved in paying for this plan. But I think Republicans really do want to try to make a deal when it comes to infrastructure. We saw just about a week ago, for instance, West Virginia Senator Shelley Moore Capito introduce a Republican counteroffer to really open the door and get the ball going on these negotiations, just kind of as a starting point. And while the proposal that she unveiled on behalf of Senate Republicans is significantly lower than what the president would like. As I mentioned, she looks at this as kind of as an opening salvo. So we do know that there have been kind of these negotiations here and there behind closed doors, and some of these negotiations have been underway for the last couple of weeks. But to your point and to Caitlin's point, it is quite significant that the president is willing to sit down with congressional leaders, because that has been a chief concern, particularly among Republicans like House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who has written to the president and says he hasn't heard back, and to folks like Mitch McConnell as well, who have been quite vocal that they have not had these types of conversations with the president. So I think certainly it will set a tone going forward as far as how negotiations could progress in the coming weeks.
Meantime, Caitlin, this afternoon, we heard former President Trump look ahead to a potential presidential run in 2024. Here's what he had to say.
I am giving it the most serious consideration, as you can imagine, and based on every poll that I'm seeing and everything else, it's something that is, very positive. Nobody's seen anything more positive, so I'm giving it very serious consideration. If you do it, I think probably the most appropriate time would be right after the 22 election. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
Could do it sooner, but I think right after the election would be good, especially if you have a good election.
Now, Caitlin, you had an interview with the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Texas's Michael McCall, this afternoon, and I want to play your question about the future of the GOP. Let's listen to that.
Who would you say is the leader of the Republican Party right now?
That's a great question. It's a very good question. I mean, I think time will tell. Okay. I mean, I think there are a lot of very good, qualified people out there that believe in our values. But I think. There's not just one right now.
Boy, Caitlin, that laugh off the top really seemed to be revealing. What did you take away from that response there?
Yeah, I think that laugh said it all. Several people are going to be watching Trump's decision. One of them is Nikki Haley, who is a potential 2024 candidate herself, who has said that she won't run if Trump decides to run. And you have several other potential 2024 candidates on the Republican side who will be watching what the former president decides to do. Trump remains very popular among the base of the party, and Republicans in this post-Trump era have had to kind of try and navigate that. And I asked McCall, should former President Trump be more involved in the party? And he said that Republicans need to campaign on some of his policies and really try to target the voters that he was able to bring over to the Republican side, namely working class voters, and try to get them to turn out for people who aren't named Donald Trump. That's going to be a challenge, and that's going to be a challenge heading into the midterms, is can you recreate the turnout that you saw with Trump at the top of the ticket last year, when Republicans were able to gain many seats, more than expected. They are very optimistic, Republicans are, about retaking the House in the 2022 elections, but we'll see kind of how they navigate that, especially if the former president introduces himself more and more into the conversation. I think a lot of Republicans here on Capitol Hill are relieved that the Twitter account is still not active for the former president, so they don't always have to be responding to every little tweet. That dynamic is certainly different from last year.
Certainly different. All right, Nikole, Killion, and Caitlin Huey-Burns, we hear the din of activity behind you there, so signaling that we are approaching the time when President Biden will give his address. Thank you so much. You can stay tuned right here on CBSN to watch President Biden's address to Congress tonight. To see the American Sign Language interpretation of his remarks at 9 p.m., head to cbsnews.com/ASL.